we're in a water crisis in this state, and not like California or Texas in terms of quantity of water, but in terms of quality of water. Last year, we had a record number of beaches that were closed in Iowa. We denitrified at higher levels than we've ever denitrified here in Des Moines to make water safe. And the number of impaired waters, that is state designated waters that are effectively unsafe for human contact, the number of those is higher than it's ever been. You and I probably have the resources to go to Lake Michigan or to go to California if we want to have a beach holiday. A lot of the socioeconomic status of folks here in the metro area in particular, they go to Grays Lake as an example, or Aquabi or Saylorville. And when that beach has to be closed because of bacterial concerns with water, that really impacts their quality of life. You and I have a flexibility that some folks don't have. Agrotoxins in our surface waters in this state continue to haunt us as a water producer. Nitrate concentrations are horrible. Last year we denitrified 177 days. We had to turn on a special removal process basically half the time. Our previous record in the history of having the world's largest nitrate removal facility was 109 days. So we just kind of blew past that. We're seeing huge agrotoxin concerns in our surface waters we draw from the Des Moines and Raccoon River. And unfortunately, that's an indication that the voluntary nutrient reduction strategy, the idea, the state's professed public policy of improving environmental quality of water by talking and educating and asking agricultural producers upstream to engage in conservation practices is a horrible failure. But just articulating that and acting on that, as we have in a lawsuit, is really put us against the grain with a number of very entrenched interests in the state. And that in and of itself is how we as a society kind of evolve and progress, but nonetheless it comes with its consequences. And it certainly is not necessarily a pleasant role, but it's a role that we think, we meaning Des Moines Water Works and the Board of Trustees that I work for, think is necessary to really set environmental protection as a priority in the state. It's a state that is never embraced environmental protection. We look to our neighbors in Wisconsin and Minnesota, others like Colorado and California that embrace environmental protection as an important public health issue, but also an amenity. We have kind of sold our soul to the devil, in my view, in this state in terms of our relationship with agribusiness, particularly industrial agriculture, monocrop of corn and the consequences from that. And there's huge environmental and public health risks that are beginning to pop up now as realities, unfortunately, for us as Central Iowans. Certainly there are some great activist groups like ICCI as an example, a lot of conservation groups like the Sierra Club and others that really have an ethic towards environmental protection, but the overwhelming economic interests in this state are obviously on the other side of the teeter-totter here. The Iowa Farm Bureau, the corn growers, the soybean growers, the hog producers, the cattle producers, the poultry producers, the state legislature as a whole, really are folks who think that the status quo, that is massive industrial agricultural output that focuses on corn and focuses on hogs in this state, are kind of the economic mainstay of Iowa's success. Clearly, we think there should be a balance there. That balance is something that nobody in industrial ag wants to talk about for any length of time, but nonetheless, we think the demographic and the data, the science, will move us towards a better balance. 60% of Iowans support our lawsuit. I think Iowans generally know that 100 years of intensive industrial agriculture, and certainly the last 40 or so since the Green Revolution, with heavy use of chemical fertilizers as an example, agricultural production that's changed from pastures and ranges to animal feeding operations, has taken a toll on our state, and a toll that really involves public health consequences. Better conservation of our water and air and soil resources are going to be important to the future of our state. It's more than just wringing out another bushel of corn or another livestock head. We have long-term issues in the state that we're going to have to address and better protect. And the drainage tiles provide a main line of pollutants and a quantity of water that during flooding times is extraordinarily difficult for us downstream, right into the waters of the state. We understand the hydrogeology, the history of what's called the Des Moines Lobe, but basically the Des Moines and Raccoon River valleys. Those soils, to be productive for corn in particular, have to be drained. We understand that. But there should be a consequence for a decision to artificially drain those, and that's the consequence is what the drainage districts and our state policymakers continue to want to pretend they can avoid. And unfortunately, we downstream don't avoid it. We have more flooding, we have more polluted water, and we have a series of public health concerns because of that. But yeah, drainage tiles are very much more sophisticated now than they were when you and I were growing up. They're not tiles, they're not ceramic, they're flexible, they're easily put in. Probably necessary to raise corn, but they're mainlining pollutants and a quantity of water right to the waters of the state and to us downstream. Here, more locally, central Iowa, but also obviously the Gulf hypoxic issue. We are significant and disproportionate contributors as Iowans to poisoning the Gulf of Mexico.
Francis Tickey talks about, farming practices and how, if we altered our farming practices, you could greatly reduce the amount of nitrates that get into the water.
Yeah, there's a lot of research out there, and Francis, as a PhD level researcher and farmer himself, certainly has a special appreciation for this. But Iowa State and great agronomists at our land grant school point towards crop rotation as being a huge opportunity for better environmental protection, using more small grains, changing the root system of plants, using cover crops. All can contribute to less nitrogen leaking off of soils and off of farms into the waterways of the state. Francis in particular is a very articulate advocate for linking federal USDA aid to water protection plans for each farm, and we certainly very much support that. You and I as taxpayers subsidize corporate agriculture on a regular basis, and there's no meaningful link between that subsidy and environmental protection. So effectively we pay twice. We pay for the producers to pollute more, and then we pay for the damages associated with that pollution in creating a safe drinking water product. So horrible consequences, horrible national policy at the USDA level, but Francis, a very articulate proponent for linking aid to a responsibility for water conservation and environmental protection involving water coming off the farms.
A majority of Iowans want clean water. They see the issues. What do they need to do?
Great question.
They answer the polls. They say they want clean water. They tell their legislators what can they do to make it happen?
Well, on a very positive front, Iowans need to talk to their political leaders at the county level, at the city level, at the state level about the need to regulate for clean water. We don't have safe air or safe pharmaceuticals or safe air travel on voluntary systems. We have them on regulatory systems. Clean water is a public safety issue. We have to regulate for that. So we need to move past we all want clean water to we're willing and we demand regulation to be able to support that. And that again involves local, county, and state levels of discussion. And we, I think, as consumers need to recognize there can be a balance between sustainable agriculture and our citizenship in a state that's heavily agricultural. We've bought into the platitude that Iowa feeds the world. Well, of course, Iowa doesn't feed the world. Half of our corn goes to ethanol, as an example. And 90% of the food that you and I purchase at a grocery store is raised out of state. So we feed gas tanks, we feed the Chinese pork that we export to them off of our animal feeding operations in this state. It's time that we rebalance that with our needs as citizens to protect our environment. And that's going to involve stepping up, being counted, and recognizing that there are significant economic interests and political interests weighing on the other side of this issue that have dominated the state's Democratic and Republican politics for many years. We're going to have to, as voters, as consumers, recognize that we have to recast that, and there's going to be resistance in that process. But ultimately, this state should be more than a feedlot between two beautiful rivers, the Missouri and the Mississippi River. But the path that we've allowed ourselves to go down really is positioning us for more and more corn crop, animal feeding operations, with the corn being exported or used for ethanol and the animals being exported and often living in horrible conditions for Asian consumption. We went through a bird flu epidemic that cost us as Iowans about $100 million is my understanding. Very little discussion about what that means to you and I as taxpayers, and very little discussion about the ethical issues associated with livestock and husbandry systems that put animals in that kind of condition where a contagion can essentially obliterate populations with extraordinary speed. We need to be thinking more ethically and more sustainably about how agriculture should operate in our state and the environmental consequences for the existing system and moving it towards sustainability. And our state policy leaders have gone out of their way to subsidize more nitrogen production. We have multi-billion-dollar chemical synthetic nitrogen facilities being built across the state, and now we're encouraging 9 million more hogs added to the 20 or so million we already have in Mason City and Sioux City with these huge hog kill operations. At some point, we as Iowans, as voters, as consumers, as residents, as citizens, as interested parties, need to recognize that there has to be some meaningful regulation. At what point do we have too many animals and too much synthetic nitrogen being generated in this state? We are very convinced that there's already a significant public health consequence in terms of nitrate concentrations in our drinking water that we spend a lot of money to make safe. But that's not sustainable, and we as Iowans are more, seemingly at the elective level, are more attracted by X number of jobs being created when these hog kill plants or nitrogen manufactured fertilizer plants come on board than we are about the environmental consequences. We have to change our thought process and think more in terms of environmental protection than adding more hogs and more nitrogen into our access pool. Just basically this, we've talked a lot about the environmental issues. There are social justice issues involved here also. Here in Des Moines, about 3/4 of our public school students receive subsidized meals at schools, in their public schools. The costs of agricultural production are being pushed to their families. That is a huge social economic consequence that I think we need to think about as Iowans. Where's the fairness in that? What we're asking simply is for agricultural accountability. There's a real cost of producing corn or raising hogs that the market doesn't reflect. Regulation can, in fact, true that up, so that the wealth being generated in industrial agricultural production isn't happening on the backs of our consumers. We need to very carefully look at both that economic issue as well as the environmental consequences from that, because they are serious and significant and worsening economic and public health consequences particularly to those of us who live in central Iowa because of agrotoxins and agricultural production upstream.